across 19,000 light-years of charted space, no name inspired more immediate, unquestioning terror than the Drakuun Hegemony. In 3,000 years of expansion, the hegemony had never lost a war, it had never needed to negotiate a peace treaty from a position of weakness. Species that resisted were dismantled, their homeworlds stripped of resources and repurposed as forward operating bases. Species that surrendered quickly were absorbed, their populations converted into labor castes, serving the hegemony's endless industrial machine. There was no third option. There had never needed to be one. So when hegemony scout vessels, mapping the outer rim of unclaimed space, detected faint radio emissions leaking from a small unremarkable system on the galaxy's edge, Supreme Overlord Craxus Thorn did not hesitate. A new species, reported Fleet Commander Yesariavel, presenting the scout data on the Obsidian command table aboard the Hegemony flagship, Devourer of Nations, designation, Earth. Third planet of an unremarkable yellow star, technology level consistent with early atmospheric flight and primitive orbital satellites, no detected weapons capable of engaging a hegemony vessel. Thorne studied the holographic projection of the small blue world with the detached interest of a being who had personally overseen the conquest of 41 civilizations. Population estimate? Approximately 8 billion, Overlord, fractured into competing nation-states, frequently at war with one another. Cultural analysis suggests deep internal division, religious conflict, resource disputes, ideological fractures spanning centuries. Then they will fall quickly, Thorne said. A species that cannot unite against itself will not unite against us. Dispatch the 4th Legion. Full subjugation protocol. I want this world's resources flowing into hegemony supply lines within one lunar cycle. It was, by every measure the hegemony had ever used to judge a target, a reasonable and unremarkable decision, the kind Thorne had made 40 times before without incident. It would prove to be the single greatest miscalculation. In 3,000 years of Drakuun history, 11 months before that scout data reached the Devourer of Nations, a joint task force operating out of a classified facility beneath the Rocky Mountains, had already detected the hegemony's reconnaissance drones entering the outer solar system. Dr. Elena Marsh, director of the Global Aerospace Defense Initiative, an organization, so classified that fewer than 300 people across the entire planet knew of its existence, stood before a room of assembled military leaders, from 22 nations, delivering a briefing she had rehearsed in her mind for the better part of a decade. We've tracked the drone's flight patterns for 11 months, she said, pulling up a star chart marked with faint, looping trajectories. They're not curious, they're cataloging population density, industrial output, military dispersal, communications infrastructure. This is a species preparing an invasion, and based on trajectory analysis, we estimate contact with a full invasion force within 18 months. General Okonkwo Adebayo, chairing the assembled council, folded his hands. Doctor, humanity has never faced anything like this. What exactly do you propose we do with 18 months' warning against a civilization capable of interstellar travel? I propose, Marsh said, that we stop thinking about this, the way every alien invasion movie ever made has trained us to think about it. We're not going to out-tech them. We've confirmed that much already. Whatever this species is, their propulsion and energy systems are centuries beyond ours. But we've had 11 months of warning that no other conquered species in their history has ever had, based on everything we've been able to piece together about their pattern of attack. And there's exactly one thing history has taught humanity better than any other species we know of. And that is? Marsh's expression didn't waver. How to turn 18 months of desperation into a weapon nobody sees coming. What the Global Aerospace Defense Initiative built in the following 18 months was not, by any conventional definition, a military fleet. Humanity did not possess the industrial base or the scientific foundation to construct warships capable of directly engaging hegemony vessels. And every serious analysis conducted by Marsh's team confirmed that any attempt to do so would end in swift, total defeat. Instead, drawing on decades of quietly shared research between rival nations, finally, truly unified for the first time in human history by the simple, terrifying fact of a shared and total existential threat, the initiative built something The hegemony's 3,000-year history of conquest had never once encountered a defense built entirely around exploiting the psychological and structural weaknesses of an empire that had never needed to develop contingencies for failure. Every species they've ever conquered fell because it fought the hegemony as an enemy that could be defeated in open battle. Marsh explained to the assembled council in her final briefing, before the projected invasion date, "We're not going to do that, we're going to make them believe they've already won, and then make that victory as expensive and as hollow as we possibly can." The plan, codenamed Operation Threshold, rested on 3 coordinated components, each built specifically to exploit weaknesses that hegemony doctrina Euros, forged across 3,000 years of uninterrupted victory Euros, had never needed to guard against. The first was disinformation on a scale no species had ever attempted against the hegemony. Falsified industrial and military data, quietly seeded into every communications frequency. Hegemony scout drones had been observed monitoring, designed to make Earth's defenses appear even weaker and more fractured than they actually were, luring the invasion force into overconfidence and dangerously light initial deployment. The second was a network of underground manufacturing facilities, built in secret across 6 continents over the preceding decade under the cover of ordinary infrastructure projects, capable of rapidly producing millions of small, cheap, expendable drones Euros, individually worthless against hegemony shielding, but capable, in overwhelming numbers, of saturating and burning out defensive systems, never designed to process volume of low-value targets simultaneously. The third, and most critical, was patience. Marsh's team had studied every fragment of hegemony technology and doctrine they could piece together from the drone wreckage and intercepted transmissions, and had concluded that the hegemony's greatest strength a Euro's total, unbroken confidence born of 3,000 years without meaningful resistance a Euros, was also its single greatest vulnerability. An empire that had never needed to adapt would not know how to recognize the moment adaptation became necessary, until it was already too late. The 4th Legion entered Earth's solar system 9 months after Thorne's order, precisely on the timeline the hegemony's ancient conquest doctrine dictated. Overwhelming initial force, rapid orbital dominance, immediate subjugation broadcasts to break the will of a planet's population, before any organized resistance could coalesce. What greeted them instead was a planet that appeared, by every sensor reading and every scrap of intercepted communication, exactly as fractured and vulnerable as hegemony intelligence, had promised Euros divided governments, broadcasting panicked, contradictory messages, minimal coordinated military response, industrial output that suggested a species barely capable of building conventional aircraft, let alone anything resembling a coordinated defense. Legion Commander Vessus Karn, overseeing the invasion from the command deck of the lead cruiser Talon's Reach, found the planet's apparent helplessness almost disappointingly straightforward. "Deploy the first wave," Karn ordered. "Standard subjugation protocol, establish orbital dominance, then begin ground deployment across the 12 largest population centers." It was exactly the order Elena Marsh's team had spent 18 months, hoping he would give. The hegemony's first wave dropped into low orbit with the same unhurried confidence that had characterized 41 previous conquests, expecting minimal resistance and encountering, instead, a swarm of Euros, not of warships, not of conventional weapons, but of millions of small, cheap, radar-invisible drones, launched simultaneously from concealed facilities across every continent, converging on hegemony vessels in numbers that no defensive system in the hegemony's arsenal had ever been designed to process. Individually, each drone was almost laughably insignificant, incapable of penetrating even the lightest hegemony shielding. But shields, by their nature, required constant power allocation to process incoming threats, and no hegemony engineer in 3,000 years had ever needed to design a system capable of tracking, prioritizing and intercepting several million simultaneous low-value targets at once. The drones didn't need to destroy anything, they only needed to overwhelm. "Commander, shield systems across the fleet are reporting critical processing overload," reported Karn's tactical officer, disbelief evident even through the hegemony's typically flat vocal patterns. "We're being swarmed, Commander." By what appears to be children's toys, concentrate defensive fire, Karn snapped. Burn them out of the sky. But concentrated fire, it turned out, was exactly the trap Marsh's team had spent 18 months preparing for. As hegemony vessels diverted power and attention to burning down the drone swarm, their primary weapon systems Euros, designed for large, decisive strikes against organized military targets, not for sustained, dispersed engagement against millions of individually worthless drone Euros, began overheating, their capacitors straining under a demand pattern no hegemony engineer had ever tested for. By the second day of the invasion, what should have been a routine, one-sided conquest had become something the hegemony's 3,000-year history had no framework to properly understand. A slow, grinding war of attrition against an enemy that refused to fight, the kind of battle the hegemony knew how to win. Every hegemony vessel that descended into Earth's atmosphere found itself facing not organized military resistance, which hegemony doctrine was built to crush decisively, but a chaotic, decentralized swarm of drones, decoys and small-scale disruptions that offered no single decisive target to strike, no capital city whose fall would break the planet's will, no unified command structure, whose destruction would end the resistance in a single stroke. They have no central authority we can target. Karn reported to Overlord Thorn, 11 days into an invasion originally projected to conclude within 72 hours. Every population center operates independent defensive systems. Destroying one changes nothing about the others. Our fleet has sustained 31% losses to what our own intelligence assessed, prior to engagement, as a technologically primitive and hopelessly divided species. Thorn's silence, transmitted across the vast gulf between the Devourer of Nations and the increasingly desperate 4th Legion, carried a weight that every hegemony officer monitoring the exchange understood instinctively. In 3,000 years, no commander had ever needed to explain losses of this magnitude to the Supreme Overlord. Reinforce the 4th Legion, Thorn finally ordered. Deploy the 9th and 11th Legions immediately. This ends now. But reinforcement, by the time it arrived 3 weeks later, arrived into a battle space that had fundamentally changed. Elena Marsh's team, watching the hegemony's response with grim, exhausted satisfaction, had used the intervening weeks to study every captured fragment of hegemony technology recovered from the wreckage of the failed first invasion. Reverse engineering shield harmonics, weapons calibration, and communication protocols with a speed born of pure existential necessity. When the 9th and 11th Legions arrived, they found an enemy no longer relying purely on overwhelming numbers, but on precisely targeted strikes, exploiting specific, now understood weaknesses in hegemony shield technology Euros, strikes calibrated by human engineers who had spent 3 desperate weeks, doing what the hegemony itself had never once needed to do in 3,000 years of uninterrupted conquest, learning, in real time, exactly how to defeat an enemy they had never fought before. The war lasted 4 months in total Euros, a brief, catastrophic footnote by the standards of most hegemony campaigns, but long enough to cost the Drakuun Hegemony more ships, more soldiers, and more strategic credibility than any single conflict in its 3,000-year history. By the war's final weeks, the hegemony had committed 6 full legions to a conquest originally projected to require a fraction of one, and had lost, by conservative estimate, more than half of every vessel deployed to a species their own intelligence had confidently classified as primitive and hopelessly divided. Supreme Overlord Craxus Thorn's final order of the campaign, transmitted 11 weeks after the war's disastrous beginning, was one no Drakuun commander had issued in living memory. Full withdrawal, and a formal recommendation to the hegemony's ruling council that Earth be marked as a world never to be approached again. We catalogued their divisions and called them weakness. Thorn's final report to the council read, recovered years later and studied extensively by human historians, who obtained it through channels, never fully disclosed to the public. We failed entirely to understand that a species capable of setting aside 3,000 years of internal conflict within 18 months, the instant a genuine external threat appeared, was not weak at all. It was simply waiting for a reason to become dangerous. We gave them that reason, we will not make that mistake a second time. On Earth, in the quiet aftermath of a war that had cost the planet dearly, but had, against every reasonable expectation, ended in victory, Dr. Elena Marsh stood before the same assembled council that had first authorized Operation Threshold nearly 2 years earlier. They called us fractured, she told them. Divided, weak, and for most of human history, they weren't entirely wrong, but they made the same mistake every predator makes when it looks at prey that's been fighting itself for centuries. They assumed that fighting each other meant we didn't know how to fight together. They never accounted for the one thing every single human being on this planet has always understood, somewhere underneath all our differences. That the moment something truly threatens all of us at once, none of those differences matter anymore. She looked out at the faces of leaders who, 2 years earlier, had questioned whether humanity could survive contact with a civilization more powerful than anything in its history. The most feared empire in known space attacked our world, she said, convinced they had found the easiest conquest of their entire history. What they found instead, when it mattered most, was exactly what they should have expected from a species that had spent its whole existence learning how to survive, being divided. They found out what happens when that same species finally decides to stand together. Above her, through the reinforced windows of the command facility, Earth's sky remained clear and quiet, exactly as it had been before the invasion began. And exactly as, for the first time, in the planet's long and violent history, the vast majority of its people finally understood just how close they had come to losing it altogether, and just how completely, when it truly mattered, they had refused to let that happen.